Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. I'd like to welcome you to the first of a series of high holiday dirashot, or teachings that Hadar is putting on in anticipation of the high holidays. In tonight's class, Rav Shai Held will be teaching at the beginning of the month of Elul on embracing vulnerability, Teshuvah, ethics, and the age of COVID. I want to encourage you all to check out hadar.org for all of the upcoming dirashot and other programming that are happening throughout the month of Elul. We have daily and weekly classes happening early in the morning. We have slichot. We have kids and teens programming and a number of other interesting learning programs that I'm sure there's something for everyone. I also want to encourage folks to also look at hadar.org for our High Holiday Reader for September 2020, which just came out. You can download it now at hadar.org. And if you'd like, you have until Friday to submit a form on our website to have a physical copy mailed to you. You can find all of that at hadar.org, and I'll put a special link to each of those forms in the chat soon. With that, we will be sharing the source sheet in the chat as well as on screen for you to download. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Rabbi Shai Held to get us started, and I'll share those links and the source sheet momentarily.
Thank you, Marty. Good evening, everyone. Erev Tov. I wanted to spend some time tonight thinking about the question of vulnerability. A topic that I think is actually really fundamental to theology and spirituality in general, but that feels particularly poignant and alive this Elul. And I want to just sort of begin by saying, I want to express kind of two poles about the issue of vulnerability, because on the one hand, the experience of COVID has reminded, I think, all of us to one extent or another, and most of us to a very significant extent, of our own fragility and vulnerability. And that vulnerability and fragility has been amplified, I think, by the ostensible randomness of this virus. Why some people get the virus and are basically fine, and others get the virus and their life is totally turned upside down or taken from them. So on the one hand, this is a time when we're all keenly aware of our own vulnerability, assurances we might have had about being in this age group or that age group, about being in this kind of health bracket or that kind of health bracket. All of that feels pretty tenuous at best. And yet, I also want to avoid being Pollyannish here and kind of ignoring the reality of the privilege that many of us live with. One of the things that this illness has also brought out is the ways that vulnerability is so frequently unevenly distributed in our society. The statistics, for example, about how Black patients fare with COVID as opposed to white patients are alarming in the extreme and indicative probably of social ills that go back generations. So I do want to talk tonight about the way that a kind of sense of shared vulnerability shapes Jewish ethics and spirituality. But I also really do want to do so with a consciousness, with an insistence that we remain conscious of the ways that, in fact, in our society, vulnerability and fragility are not so equally distributed, to say the least. Okay? And with that, so the title of tonight's lecture, Shiur, Embracing Vulnerability, Teshuvah, Ethics, and the Age of COVID. I wanted to begin with Deuteronomy 11, a text that I have had occasion to learn with some of you before, a text that has become very important to me in the last few years personally, as I find it kind of endlessly surprising. Deuteronomy 11, in singing the praises of the land of Israel, which is being promised to the Israelites, offers a comparison between Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, on the one hand, and Eretz Mitzrayim, the land of Egypt, on the other. And what is odd about the comparison of Israel and Egypt, which is supposed to be a comparison that emphasizes the vast superiority of Israel over Egypt, in fact, a cursory reading of the text seems to imply that Egypt is in fact the superior place. We read in Varim Yud Aleph, this is text number 1, the land that you are about to enter and take possession of, it is not like the land of Egypt, asher yitzatem misham, from which you have departed. Rather, asher tizra et zaracha v'ishkita v'raglecha kigan hayarak. Right there, you sowed grain, and it was watered by your own laborers like a vegetable garden. The thing that I want to just point out about this is that the Nile irrigates itself. Now, you might have to do planting, but you reliably have water. And in contrast to that, Deuteronomy says, it is a land of mountains and valleys, hills and valleys. It depends on the rain in order to be irrigated. Now, if you are a farmer and you are told, I'll tell you what, I'm going to take you out of a land. I am going to take you out of a land, and that land that I'm going to take you from is reliably irrigated. It flows with water, it irrigates itself, but I'm going to take you to a better place. It's going to be a place with droughts. It's going to be a place where there's often not enough. You might say as a farmer, with all due respect, I'll take Egypt. Because as a farmer, what I want is a reliable land. I don't want a land that is always vulnerable to the whims of the weather. Now look how the Torah goes on to describe the land. Eretz, asher Adonai Elohecha doreshota tamid, asher Adonai Elohecha doreshota tamid enei Adonai Elohecha ba mereshita shana ve'ad acharit shana. The land of Israel is the land which the Lord your God looks after. God always keeps an eye on this land from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. Now, without defending this reading as strenuously as I might if we had a smaller crowd and a longer time, I will say that what I think is actually going on in this text is quite subtle. And it is essentially the argument that the land of Egypt, which irrigates itself reliably, is in fact a spiritually and ethically dangerous land. Because in a land like Egypt, you forget how much you are dependent on forces outside your control. Whereas the land of Israel is a blessing because the fact that you have to pray for rain reminds you of your vulnerability and dependence and the fragility of everything that you have. Now, again, from a certain kind of capitalistic narrative perspective, that may not be all that desirable, but from a biblical spiritual perspective, an awful lot, I'm tempted to say everything, in fact, hinges on acknowledging and keeping in my awareness all the time the sheer vulnerability of my situation. Right? Devarim, probably more than any book in the Torah, is preoccupied with the fear lest the people come to believe that everything they have, they did and made for themselves, and essentially forget about God. The great fear of the book of Deuteronomy is you will forget about God. The land, which is a gift, will in fact become a snare. It will become a scene of forgetfulness, a place of the illusion of total lack of dependence, the illusion of invulnerability. That's why the land of Israel needs to be a place which the physical geography of which has to militate against that sense of spoiledness and invulnerability. Okay, that's the argument I want to make. God wants us to remember our dependence and vulnerability, and then the question becomes, why? Why is it so important that the people remember their vulnerability always? And I think that there are two answers to this. And I'm going to focus tonight because, as the title suggests, on ethics. But I want to say, first of all, the Torah is preoccupied with the idea that there is no easier path to forgetting about God than having the illusion of vulnerability and self-sufficiency. There is no greater, simpler, more straightforward path to losing sight of God altogether than essentially believing, yeah, I did it all myself. I don't owe anything. But there's an ethical dimension too, which is if I don't owe anything, if I'm invulnerable, if I'm totally independent, if I'm utterly autonomous, then it's not such a big step to arguing from there to the fact that I don't owe anybody anything. And more than that, if I convince myself that I am the author of every last one of my successes, I may be tempted to condescend to those who have at the moment less successes, fewer blessings than I do, right? In other words, what vulnerability does is remind me of my shared humanity, even with people who have less than I do. And what do I mean by that? Let's flesh that out for a minute. So Morty, if you scroll down, I'm going to read for a minute from the philosopher Lawrence Blum. Lawrence Blum is Jewish, but not particularly engaged with Judaism. He's a moral philosopher, a very significant moral philosopher, who writes the following in an essay about compassion. He says, compassion also involves viewing the other person and his suffering in a certain way. I can put this by saying that compassion involves a sense of shared humanity, of regarding the other as a fellow human being. This means that the other person's suffering, though not necessarily their afflicting condition, is seen as the kind of thing that could happen to anyone, including oneself, insofar as one is a human being. Maybe it's very unlikely that I would end up an alcoholic, but I might become addicted to something else. Maybe it's unlikely that I'll end up with the kind of cancer you ended up with, but maybe I'll end up with a different kind, right? And compassion, he says, is dependent on a sense of shared humanity. Otherwise, what I have is not compassion, but pity, right? For something to be compassion rather than pity, I need to believe that by dint of our shared humanity, something akin to what has happened to you could happen to me. Our shared humanity makes us able to connect across the lines drawn by suffering. Go on to the next paragraph where he says, this way of viewing the other person contrasts with the attitude characteristic of pity, in which one holds oneself apart from the afflicted person and from their suffering, thinking of it as something that defines that person as fundamentally different from oneself, right? Sarah Brooks may have this problem, but I could never have that problem because I'm superior to Sarah in every way. I'm only giving Sarah as an example because everybody knows I'm not superior to Sarah in any way. But, okay, that problem could affect Paul. It couldn't affect me. In this way, he says, the other person's condition is taken as given, whereas in compassion, the person's affliction is seen as deviating from the general conditions of human flourishing. That is why pity, unlike compassion, involves a kind of condescension, and why compassion is morally superior to pity. Some Buddhists talk about pity as the close enemy of compassion, because on the surface, it actually looks very similar, but in reality is a totally different posture. And then just one more paragraph from Larry Blum. Because compassion involves a sense of shared humanity, it promotes the experience of equality, even when accompanied by an acknowledgement of actual social inequality. Compassion forbids regarding social inequality as establishing human inequality. We might say compassion prohibits you from seeing social inequality as somehow a sign of metaphysical or even ontological inequality. This is part of the moral force of compassion, Larry Blum says. By transcending the recognition of social inequality, it promotes the sensed experience of equality in common humanity. Now, I apologize for bringing my own writing as a text here, but I think this is another useful way of saying this. Building on Larry Blum, what I suggest in the Heart of Torah is that we ought to see pity as fundamentally a vertical posture, whereas compassion is a horizontal posture. Pity is about the illusion that I stand above you and I reach down to you. Think of Blum's language around condescension. Compassion is about not reaching down, but instead reaching across and insisting on reasserting and re-experiencing fully the shared humanity. Oh, your spouse treated you badly, my spouse could treat me badly. You've been overcome by cancer, I could be overcome by cancer too, by heart disease, by whatever it might be. And this is really integral, and it allows me to emphasize here something that many of you have heard me say many times over the years, which is that Jewish ethics is concerned not just with what I do, but also with who I am in the moment that I'm doing it. Deuteronomy makes a claim not just on the deed, but also on the heart. When we are told not to refrain from giving a poor person a loan as the Shemitah approaches, we are told not to harden our hearts or tighten our fists. It would have been enough if the caricature of Judaism was correct to say, don't tighten your fists. After all, if that's a matter of action. But we're not told that. We're told, don't harden your heart or tighten your fist. That is to say, give and be a particular kind of person as you're giving. So in other words, what I'm saying is this: compassion is better than pity, first of all, because very often a discerning person can tell when they're being pitied and come to resent it pretty quickly. But second of all, because there's an intrinsic value, there's a moral weight placed on who I am, on my emotional life, on my inner world, on my interiority in the moment when I encounter another person. And there is something morally different about encountering someone from a place of pity and encountering someone from a place of compassion. Okay. And with that in mind, let's scroll down, Morty, if you would, to source 4. The book of Proverbs says the following very interesting thing. Ashir varash nifgashu osechulam Adonai. The JPS renders this rich man and poor man meet, God is maker of them all. But I don't think nifgashu here means meet. I think nifgashu here, as other translations I think more astutely get, means meet in the metaphorical sense. They have this in common. Rich and poor have this in common. The Lord is maker of them all. God makes all of them. I'll just mention here, although it's not super pertinent to what I'm talking about, the evangelical Christian Bible scholar Derek Kidner makes a really astute comment about this verse. He says, if this verse were in Ecclesiastes, it would say something like, the rich person and the poor person have this in common. They all end up in the same place. It would appeal to shared mortality, whereas Proverbs appeals to, as it were, shared natality, right? The fact that we both come from the same place. Now, why is this? How is this related to vulnerability? Well, on some level, this is an acknowledgement that, in the words of Job, I'm wealthy and I came from a womb. You're poor and you came from a womb. At some very fundamental level, there's actually no real difference between you and me. We're both fundamentally dependent and therefore ought to be grateful for the gift of life that we've received. Now, but I think the vulnerability gets expressed more explicitly in this next passage from Mishlei. Rash ve'ish techachim nifgashu, me'ir enei shnehem Adonai. The poor and the oppressor have this in common: the Lord gives light to the eyes of both. And gives light to the eyes of both means makes them function, enables them to be alive, gives them their life breath, makes them able to be in the world. In other words, I may be tempted to foster the illusion that I am a self-made man, to use one of the most toxic phrases in the English language. But as I never tire of quoting, that occasioned Mark Twain's most memorable line ever, in my opinion: a self-made man is like a self-laid egg. It's always and everywhere a lie. And that's what the Bible again and again and again wants to teach. And I think you could say something else in a way that may be helpful for some people to kind of wrap our heads around this. In many ways, I think what the book of Exodus is about it is about how do you go from destructive dependence to healthy trust? How do you go from being dependent against your will on someone who doesn't care about your well-being, or in fact actively disdains concern for your well-being, to, on the other hand, trusting in God, who seeks your well-being? In other words, the book of Exodus does not imagine that the journey is from damaging dependence on Pharaoh to autonomy, but rather from damaging dependence on Pharaoh to productive and life-giving dependence on God. That is a very, very different thing. It's a crucial thing, I think, in the eyes of Shemot. That is the meaning. I mean, you should never say about a story that it is the meaning of a story. Literature is too complex for that. But one of the key meanings of Exodus 16, the story of the manna, is precisely the art of learning to trust well those who deserve your trust. Right? There's no naivete there. From the eyes of Shemot, right? God has earned their trust. Okay? And by the way, just to sort of belabor this for a minute, I think I might have taught this at some point before Pesach to some of you, that it's a very, very interesting moment in the book of Shemot, that when Moshe asks Paro for an opportunity for the Jewish people, for the Israelites, to take a holiday to worship God in the desert, in the wilderness, Paro angrily accuses Moshe and Aaron of hishbatem. You have caused the people to take a Sabbath from their labor. Ironically, and against his own will, it is Paro who introduces the notion of Shabbat for slaves into the book of Exodus by rejecting it. And then when God brings the people together to build a Mishkan, and Moshe repeats the instructions for building a Mishkan, what is the first thing that Moshe says to them? Don't work on Shabbat. As a worker, you're entitled to the dignity of rest. You can trust a God who has your well-being in mind, a God who regularizes and in fact insists upon your own rest, dignity, and well-being. Okay? Now, so I think, it's easy to say this, but it's important to stop and ask, what does it take for something to go from being a verse in Mishlei that no one ever reads to being something brought into consciousness that we take with us all the time? The rich and the poor have this in common. They're both fundamentally dependent. I remember for me, this is perhaps a strange thing to share, but I remember for me, it was a very powerful, although obviously also a tragic moment, when one of the richest philanthropists in the Jewish community, a person worth billions of dollars, was hit by a cab while standing on a street corner and killed in New York City. I remember thinking, all the billions in the world don't save you from a car that jumps the sidewalk. And what does it mean to, on some level, all be fundamentally and irreducibly vulnerable? And how ought it affect both and primarily the way the powerful see the defenseless, but also, maybe more complicatedly, how the defenseless see the powerful? Okay? Those, I think, are some really fundamental and important questions. Now, I wanted to just share, this is really not the main topic, and I'll confess, I don't even really know exactly what I would say about it if I pushed myself to say something about it. I want to say that Deuteronomy 11 is not the only way that Deuteronomy portrays the land. Elsewhere, Deuteronomy 8, the land is described as a good land, a land with streams and springs and fountains issuing from plain and hill. That appears to be very, very different. That appears to be very, very different from a land that is entirely dependent all the time on looking at God and hoping that God will be kind and generous and sustaining, right? So it almost makes you wonder whether what Deuteronomy is hinting at, and again, I may be going too far here, but it makes you wonder whether Deuteronomy is in part hinting it's not actually about the objective qualities of the land. It's actually about how you experience the land that you're in. Do you remember the fact that you are in fact dependent? Do you hold that in your consciousness? You have all no doubt met people who act as if they are kings of the universe and that they are totally invulnerable. I remember once saying to a room full of hedge fund managers I was teaching, one of whom was particularly of this ilk, that was sort of insistent that because he had everything in the world, he was totally safe. And I said to him in not the most generous way, you know, when you and I get into the elevator later tonight, there's as good a chance of your having an aneurysm as there is of me having an aneurysm. And then all of this talk about how wealthy you are actually doesn't amount to much of anything at all. Now, again, go back to where I began. It still remains true that that person can afford medical care that other people can't afford. So we don't want to be naive about this. And yet, there's a vulnerability here that can't be stepped away from, that can't be evaded or avoided. Okay. So with that, okay, I want to, Morty, are there questions that I should take now before I go on?
Yes, we have one question so far.
Okay.
Robert Leibowitz asked, let me just pull it up. How can we have compassion for everyone who suffers without feeling overwhelmed? Don't we necessarily need to place borders around ourselves in order to not succumb to all the suffering around us?
So that's a really important question, obviously. Let me say a couple things about it. One, which, Robert, this is not directed to you personally, but I think it's important to say, would that the problem in our society be an excess of compassion? In my experience, very few people who complain of having too much compassion have all that much compassion. Now, are there people for whom it's true that they become overwhelmed? It is true. And the question that I think that you're raising is sort of about how emotional does our compassion need to be at all times? And this is a really important question. Philosophers and psychologists both argue about whether there is something that we could call intellectual compassion. Is all compassion emotional? What I want to say about this in a way that I hope will be helpful, I think it's, first of all, very important to distinguish between compassion and empathy, in the sense that no one argues that compassion means that I have to feel the very things that the other person is feeling. Rather, I have to have an emotionally appropriate response to the other person's suffering. By the way, I would argue that that's what most sophisticated thinkers mean by empathy as well. But empathy, at least, there's a reason why people sometimes think that empathy means I'm feeling what the other person feels. Although I don't think anybody really means that. If I say to you, I'm feeling severely depressed and I want a therapist who's empathic, I don't mean I want a therapist who at the end of the session also doesn't want to get out of bed anymore. Rather, I want a therapist who responds in an emotionally appropriate way to my emotional state. Now, Robert, if your question is, but even that is too much, that is an important discussion that I think we could have. And that's where I would go back to talking about there are certain kinds of compassion that I think may be primarily intellectual rather than you know, the kind of compassion you might feel for your best friend when, God forbid, their spouse dies, which is much more, makes a direct emotional claim. We could talk about that more later. I want to just, if I could, take Nina's question before I go on. Are we obligated to feel compassion towards those who behave cruelly towards others, who themselves evince no compassion towards others? So this question is really, really obviously hard and loaded in our time. What I want to say is that, what I want to say in a word is, yes, we are. And then I can offer a lot of caveats to that. And there's two reasons that we are, I think. One is that if we give ourselves license to have no compassion for people who have no compassion, we run the very real risk of becoming just like the people we condemn for having no compassion. That was a very convoluted English sentence, but I hope it was clear what I was trying to say, right? To walk around the world saying, I don't have compassion for people who aren't compassionate, is to end up giving myself license to brutalize people in not that different a way than those people brutalize people. And more than that, if we allow ourselves to, this is something that Rabbi Yecheskel Levenstein, one of the great Musar teachers of the 20th century, says, which I think is really very important. If we allow ourselves to hate, even if you bracket the people we're hating, we will eventually be consumed by hate. There is actually no way to function in a world where you hate everyone who does anything bad. And I'm gonna go on now, but I just want to say to Joshua Sunshine's question about what about Eichmann. This is I'm gonna pick on you only to say this is a great example of what philosophers always talk about, the argumentum ad Hitlerum, which is the great philosopher Leo Strauss used to say, whenever you are losing a philosophical debate, you simply stop the conversation and say, oh yes, and what about Hitler? And no matter what people are talking about, all of a sudden the tables get turned and the person who's speaking is wrong by definition because Hitler breaks all categories. So it's not that I don't accept the question as important and difficult. It's that the fact is almost none of us is ever dealing with the question of Eichmann. And so I actually think that for most of the real work of living in the world as a loving, compassionate, caring person, Eichmann is a distraction from that conversation. Because most of the people that I am tempted to exclude are not Eichmann. They're not Eichmann. And just to anticipate some of the responses that I'm noticing floating on the bottom of my screen, which I try not to look at. I've said this many times on Hadar sessions. People always ask me, do you hate Donald Trump? And my answer to that question is pretty much always the same. There are moments when I do, but my aspiration is deeply not to. Because I don't want to be the kind of person who is filled with hate. What I feel for Donald Trump is actually deep compassion for what it would mean to live with so severe a personality disorder that you actually can't see the reality of other people at all. What does it mean to live like that? Now, to be clear, compassion for someone doesn't mean you don't try to stop them when they try to hurt other people. You can combat people politically and still have compassion for them emotionally. I really believe that. I would say, and I don't mean this to sound like a parody of myself, Donald Trump breaks my heart. I've never seen another person so utterly cut off from all other humans. And there is something enormously heartbreaking about it. What kind of childhood did that person have? And I think it's just a healthier place to live from. It's a place where you don't allow yourself to be overrun with hatred. Okay, let me go on. So let's look at verse 7 for a minute. I want to talk for a minute about the Shemitah. And one of the things that happens every 7th year is that on Sukkot, the people gather together to hear the Torah read in a reenactment of the revelation at Mount Sinai. That is what is called the mitzvah of hakel. Hakel is to gather people together. The people are brought together, and they essentially recapitulate Sinai. They stand there as the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy. I'm not really sure what Deuteronomy intends there. The book of Deuteronomy is read to them, and it's this kind of covenantal renewal ceremony. So the question that I had for many years, and that I tried to write about in the Heart of Torah, it was my first attempt to try to sort of sort that out for myself, is why attach Hakel to Sukkot? Now, obviously, in rabbinic tradition, this is not in the Torah itself, but in rabbinic tradition, the revelation takes place on what holiday? On Shavuot. Sukkot is about something else. So why attach Hakel to Sukkot? And what I came to see is that if we're going to take upon ourselves the obligation to create a community in which we love one another and care for one another and are compassionate for one another, there can be no better time to renew that commitment than on or after the festival in which we are reminded in the starkest, most physical terms of our vulnerability. What is Sukkot? It is about sitting exposed to the elements. It is acknowledging that I could be killed by the weather, that I could be swept away by the wind, metaphorically and literally. And so there's something about the Torah being re-given, the covenant being reenacted and renewed precisely at the moment when I acknowledge how vulnerable I am. Because when I acknowledge how vulnerable I am more likely to take seriously the mandate, take care of people who don't have a house to shelter them. There's something so poignant about the halacha that says if it's raining on Sukkot, you can go inside. This year, I would invite people, when Sukkot comes and it's raining and you're going inside, to think about how many people in your city have nowhere to go inside when it's raining. There's a way in which, if I'm going to mandate compassion, mandating it precisely at the moment when I realize the ways that I too might need it is really quite, I think, fundamental and basic to what it means to take this project of a compassionate society seriously. I brought you the passage from the Heart of Torah. Again, it feels a little absurd to me to bring my own writing, but it's just to sort of, these are better formulations than I can give now. You have the Kli Yakar beautifully says that one of the main projects of Shemitah, this is totally gorgeous, is it is a putting down of the quality of what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, and instead an attempt to cultivate the ethos of it's ours. What's mine is yours if only you need it. The ethos of genuine and profound sharing. Okay? Now, so the thing that I think is important for me to say now is that vulnerability is, trying to think, I'm always struggling with how to say this. Vulnerability actually is a double-edged sword, because feeling vulnerable can actually make me shut down to other people rather than open to them in compassion. So it is not simply the fact of feeling vulnerable, It is a particular experiencing vulnerability, a particular mode of experiencing vulnerability that I'm asked for here. Very often, very few experiences in and of themselves have a meaning, right? It's the meaning that I'm asked to bring to the experience of vulnerability. It's not, I don't think it's accurate to say, in other words, vulnerability teaches you compassion. A certain kind of openness to vulnerability teaches you compassion. Because you can imagine a situation where you say, hey, you know what? I'm hungry. I don't care about anyone right now but my own children. Everyone else can go to hell. And I'm saying that in that way for a reason, right? There's almost a violence to it, right? When it feels like there's scarcity. So all that really matters is me and my own. And the line of my own begins to be drawn more and more narrowly. But I think that what you have here is something, quite profound, which is no. How about the kind of vulnerability that opens you rather than closes you? The kind of vulnerability that leads you to reach across lines rather than be limited by them. That's the kind of vulnerability I think that the Torah is invested in eliciting from the people. The kind of approach to vulnerability. What I would say about this is something akin to what I've written about memory, and this may sound like a strange formulation to some people, but I'm going to try it anyway. We shape the vulnerability that in turn shapes us. We shape the way we experience vulnerability in such a way that it invites us, or ideally we do, in such a way that it invites us to respond to the vulnerability of others as well. Okay? Let me go on and do one more piece of this progression here. And then I'll take another question or two, and then we'll go on to the conclusion. If you scroll down, Morty, to source 9, I just wanted you to see here that it's important in talking about embracing vulnerability that we not valorize or even fetishize vulnerability, right? There is a certain dignity that comes from the ability to take care of me, to take care of myself, to take care of my family, that I don't think we should gainsay or try to step around. We say for a reason in Birkat HaMazon, V'na'al tatzrichenu Adonai Eloheinu, lo lidei matnat basar v'dam v'lo lidei halva'atam. We don't want to depend on gifts of other people or on loans of other people. But again, not so that we can be autonomous, but rather, but rather let me be dependent on you, on your generous hand, not let me be autonomous and utterly self-sufficient. But this becomes a major issue in halakha, where one who does not need to throw themselves on the mercy of others is not permitted to. And it is regarded as enormously sinful to say, oh, you know what? I'd rather just have people give me tzedakah rather than try to have the dignity of supporting myself. And I wanted you to see this very interesting passage in Mishneh Torah where the Rambam, I think, does something very complex. This is in the laws of tzedakah, where he says, anyone who is not actually in need of taking from the communal pot, but deceives others into thinking he is, cheats them, v'notel, and takes, that person will in fact end up poor. If you pretend to need, you'll end up needing. And in another context, in another discussion, we could talk about the inner logic of that. What does Maimonides imagine is the scenario where that happens? Okay? But then, at the same time, I may not pretend to need in order to take what I don't need, but I may not be so proud that if I do need, I don't take anyway. V'chol mi shetzarich, I just skipped to the middle of the second line. V'chol mi shetzarich litol ve'eino yachol lichyot ela im kein notel. Anyone who needs to take tzedakah, I cannot pay for the doctor's visit that I need. I cannot pay for lunch for my children. I can't live without that money for the doctor or that money or that food for my children. Elaim kein notel, unless I take kegon zakein or choleh ubal yisurin, like someone who is elderly or ill or afflicted in any one of 1,000 ways. Umegis da'ato ve'eino notel. But you make yourself haughty and say, I will not take tzedakah. Here the Rambam, in his most ferocious language, harei zeh shofech damim. Such a person is a murderer. Such a person, in other words, is a suicide. I am not equating a suicide with murder, certainly not in this day and age. I'm just trying to understand what the Rambam is saying here, right? You essentially, what he's saying is you are killing yourself. Again, don't celebrate vulnerability if that means, oh, you know what? I'm not going to work. I'll just take whatever I want. That is sinful. But don't become the kind of person who needs and is too proud to admit that you need. Because that is the sin of denying my own vulnerability. And that is a form also of failing to fulfill the mitzvah of protecting my own well-being. You have to protect your own well-being. And the Rambam here wants to say, you have to really need it, because he goes on to say, if you tried really hard, I would rather work 3 jobs. Then you've done a good thing, and one day you'll be rich and you'll be able to give people tzedakah. But if you can't, you can't. And if you need help, ask for it. Not to ask for help when you need it is murder. I like to call this the Rambam's attack on contemporary forms of masculinity. Me? Need help? I don't need help. You need help. I don't have feelings. You have feelings. I'm now being absurd, but you understand the point that I'm making. What happens when you tell people that showing vulnerability, acknowledging vulnerability, is inherently a failure, as opposed to merely a symptom of humanity? And then you see where compassion rather than pity matters so much. Because a person who's afraid to acknowledge that they are in need can smell pity from 1,000 miles away. That's the discourse of, but I don't want to be a tzedakah case. Whereas a compassionate response is, oh, it could be any of us. It's okay. It's really okay. It's a very different way of being. Let me stop. Morty, any questions I should take about these 3 first parts? And then I want to do the last part relatively briefly. Any questions you want to choose, Morty? Maybe 1 or 2, depending how long they are.
We just got a question from Betsy Strauss. Does being aware of our vulnerability require the courage and strength referred to at the close of Psalm 27, or does this have nothing to do with courage and strength?
It's a very profound psychological question, and I suspect that the answer here is probably different for different people, but I do think it's true that a genuine embrace of vulnerability requires great courage, not least because it requires trusting that other people won't take advantage of you. Right? Vulnerability, look, the Torah would not obsessively legislate about not exploiting the vulnerable if exploiting the vulnerable were not so prevalent. So acknowledging vulnerability is opening myself to being hurt and disappointed. It's opening myself to being shamed, which is the great fear of people who are vulnerable, or one of the great fears of people who are vulnerable. So I do think that it requires great courage. I also think it requires actually courage to be compassionate to someone who's vulnerable, because pity is the easy way out. Pity is, oh, here, you want tzedakah? Here, have some tzedakah. charity case. Compassion requires the courage to admit, you know what? I could lose everything too. I'll never forget, for me, a very powerful moment in growing up. I was a freshman in college, and I went to volunteer at a homeless shelter. And I had, in retrospect, I'm embarrassed to say this, but in retrospect, I don't think I was conscious of it at all. I went in there with this sense of really smug superiority. And I sat down to have dinner. It was a small shelter, something like 14 men or something. And I sat down to have dinner with one of them. And we got to talking. And I said, you know, how long have you been living here? And he said, well, it all began after I got my MSW. And I had like swallowed really hard. And I was like, well, you have a lot more degrees than I do. Right. And he told me this, like, this very moving story about how he had become a therapist and he didn't feel he had been given adequate training of how not to bring his work home. And so when he came home, he was totally distant from his wife because he felt overcome by his patient's suffering. And then one fine day, he came home from work and found his wife with another man, and it totally destroyed him. And he said, you know, I went out and I got drunk that night, and I got drunk every night after that for a year until I ended up here. And I remember thinking, you know, this guy went to all the schools that my friends went to. It was this a moment of enormous awakening for me of what compassion could look like as opposed to pity. So there's courage and compassion too, I think. The courage of admitting our frailty. And our culture is in all kinds of ways not good at this. Our discourse of I built it all myself, our discourse of I'm independent, our discourse of the self-made man, all of that is, I think, really quite toxic ultimately. Morty, any others before I go on?
I think you can go on, and we'll people
Okay.
can continue to send me questions, and we'll have a Q&A at the end.
Great. Okay. So the last part of what I want to talk about relates in a very direct, if kind of at a funny angle, to the question of COVID. And that is specifically around what do you do when you can't actually be near the person who's sick and needs your comfort. So Leviticus 13 contains one of the most, I think, distressing laws in the Tanakh. Essentially says that a mitzorah, someone who is afflicted by the scaly skin disease that Leviticus Vayikra is preoccupied with, that person has to live at a remove from the rest of the community. And in fact, the Torah says that the person has to say, Tamei Tamei, the person has, the Torah says, Tamei Tamei Yikra. That person has to be declaring all the time, impure, impure, impure. And the pshat there, the straightforward contextual meaning is, in order to make sure people know that they can't come near him. This is one of the most disturbing laws in the Torah. How does a tradition that so celebrates the mitzvah of visiting the sick create this situation where this person is extremely ill, totally vulnerable, and given the mandate to enforce their own abandonment? Ibn Ezra, the great Pashtan, the great interpreter of the pshat, of the straightforward meaning of the text, says, why does the text say tamei tamei? It says v'tamei pa'amayim. The text says tamei twice. How come? Shiomar came tami, to make it clear that a person should be saying it always. Be'ovrobam silah sheyesham yishuv. Whenever he passes a place where there are human beings who inhabit it. Why? Shishmeru b'nei adam v'lo yiguvo. So that people not come near him and touch him. Fear of contagion. And also, I suspect, since scholars of the ancient Near East have argued that the scaly skin disease here what happens is that a person who is alive begins to look like their flesh is rotting. So the person looks like a living corpse. And for Leviticus, which is so focused on the categories of living or alive, a mitzorah is an explosion of the categories of yes or no, of in or out, of pure or impure, of living or dead. And so there's a desire to not be close. Now, what I find incredibly moving about this that I wanted to show you is that the Talmudic sages fundamentally rework what's going on here to humanize it, okay? Because they take, this is presumably not the pshat, they take the mandate for the mitzorah to say all the time, tameh, 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 impure, impure, keep away, impure, impure. They take it to mean, look at the Talmud, Masechet Nidah, source 12, Tanya, v'tameh tameh yikra, tzarich lahodia tza'aro l'rabim. The reason the person says impure, impure, impure is to let other people know that he needs their prayers. Rather than protecting them from him, he makes himself vulnerable to them. And they in turn, v'rabim mevakshim alav rachamim, and they in turn have to pray for him. In other words, what the sages do with this, consciously or not, is take a biblical passage that appears to be about distancing people from the sick and transform it into a passage that is about those who are ill ask for help and those who are healthy grant it. Or if you prefer, those who are sick ask for compassion and those who are healthy grant it. And what began as a biblical verse that's about separation becomes a rabbinic interpretation that is in some fundamental way about reestablishing human connection. Now, the rabbis don't have, right? You know, if you want, not if one wants the rabbis to say about a biblical text, I don't like this, this seems immoral, one's not going to find that. That's not one of the options that they have. But what you do find is, consciously or unconsciously, a profound reimagining of the scenario, such that a person who's vulnerable has to admit to her vulnerability, and the person who is asked to respond to that person's vulnerability embraces their compassion rather than choosing the route of pity, or even worse, ignoring or shunning. And I think that there's something quite important there. This is something about which, in a slightly different register, Rachel Adler has written about, I think, quite movingly, how a certain kind of way of reading yields a more humane text. And then my comment about this, the rabbinic interpretation profoundly alters the human dynamic that unfolds between the Metzorah and the rest of the community. It tries to elicit a deeper level of humanity, both from the afflicted and from the community at large. And that's really the point that I want to make, right? A person who is ill may be tempted to withdraw psychologically. The one who is suffering from an illness so closely associated with death and impurity, all the more so. But the Torah invites him not to grant stigma and shame the final word. One who needs divine mercy should ask for it, and one who yearns to know that others care for him should ask for expressions of love and concern. And then conversely, those who are unafflicted may be tempted to look down at those who are. There we go again with pity, right? Looking down at. To see those whose illness is suggestive of death is less than fully human and thus unworthy of their compassion. So and then I emphasize here, the rabbinic interpretation of the Torah reminds them that the ill are no less human than the well. To be asked to pray for someone is to be charged with affirming their humanity totally and unconditionally, and with cultivating empathy for them. So here, the reason I wanted to end with this, at least for the frontal piece of this, is that I think there's something very interesting about this in the moment of COVID, where you may very often find yourself wanting to reach across and be with someone physically who you're not able to actually physically be with. In fact, you may be halachically prohibited from being with because of protection of yourself and other people you may infect if you get too close. And yet, how do we live in a way that doesn't mean we're all closed off in our own fortresses with no responsibility for one another? And instead, how do we reach across to each other even while honoring the boundaries that we wish were not there but are there? How do we live in such a way that acknowledges the boundaries that we can't remove and yet seeks to use love and compassion in a way that overcomes those boundaries? That is this moment's version, I think, of the larger project of cultivating a life of compassion rather than pity. And let me just say one final word here, which obviously could be its own lecture and shiur, but I just want to sort of say it because I imagine I'm going to get questions about this. At a certain point in a society, when you have compassion for people, you begin to ask, in which situations is the person suffering from something that is unavoidable by dint of being human? And in which situation is the person suffering because they are victims of injustice? And genuine compassion looks to be aware where the issue is injustice, so that compassion can yield a passion for justice. Love can yield a passion for justice and not just compassion. To respond to people who are homeless only with compassion without asking questions like, why is anyone homeless? Why are certain people homeless? Why are certain classes and races more frequently homeless than others? Those are important questions. And compassion there is not in tension with justice, but actually becomes the emotional energy that yields a passion for justice. Thank you. Morty, you want to give me maybe one more, since I want to honor it. I have 8:59 on my clock. I want to honor the time, but if you have another one for me, I'm happy to take it.
It's actually 9:01 on my clock, so I want to close this out and thank you, Rabbi Held, for this talk. Once again, you should check out hadar.org for other programming. I'll put the link to our virtual Beit Midrash as well as the link to downloading or filling out a form to receive our High Holiday Reader. Is there anything else you wanted to say, Rav Shai?
No, just since it's the beginning of Elul, to wish everyone a Ktiva v'chatima tova, to wish all of us and our loved ones and really the whole world health and safety, and the hope that before too long we can emerge from this incredibly difficult time into a period of light. Shana Tova to you all, and we hope to see you at more learning opportunities with Hadar in the next few weeks.